The sirens faded into the distance as officers stepped into a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. At first glance, the scene appeared ordinary. Just another suburban house tucked into a quiet neighborhood. But the front door hung loosely from its hinges, as though it had been forced open in desperation. The air inside was thick with something indescribable, a weight that pressed down on the chest. What they found there would stay with them long after the investigation was closed, long after the news cycle forgot, and long after paperwork turned into statistics. Some crimes scar the soul, and this was one of them. The first officer to enter froze where he stood, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam of light caught a trail, faint but unmistakable, leading deeper into the house. It was not just the sight of it that unsettled them, but the way silence seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every shallow breath. The kitchen was the first stop, and here the story began to unfold in fragments. A chair overturned, a cup shattered into dozens of jagged pieces, and food left half, prepared on the counter as if someone had been interrupted mid-motion. But it was the refrigerator door that caught the eye. Handprints smeared across it, small and desperate, marked in a way no officer could ignore. The prints told a story louder than words, of someone struggling, someone terrified, someone too young to leave such evidence behind. One officer muttered something under his breath, a prayer or perhaps a curse, but the others pressed forward, unwilling yet unable to stop. The living room was worse. A family portrait rested on the mantel, smiling faces immortalized in a moment of joy, yet in the room itself lay a scene completely opposite of that memory. The officers noticed signs of chaos, cushions ripped apart, a lamp broken, books scattered. What chilled them most, however, was the blanket on the floor, neatly spread, as though someone had tried to create a safe corner. On it sat a stuffed toy, untouched, its stitched eyes staring blankly into nothing. The smallest details are often the ones that linger longest in memory, and this toy would haunt them, a reminder of innocence crushed by cruelty. One officer later admitted he wanted to pick it up, to shield it from what it had witnessed, but he could not bring himself to touch it. As they made their way down the hall, the atmosphere only grew heavier. Each step echoed like a warning, and each door opened revealed something worse than the last. The bathroom sink was running, though no one was there. A soaked towel on the floor told of a frantic attempt at cleaning, a rushed erasure of what had happened. It was not successful. The stains remained, clear under the pale bathroom light. One of the younger officers excused himself, stepping outside for air, but found none. His breath shook, his hands would not still, and though he tried to compose himself, the image burned in his mind would not leave. Then came the bedrooms, where the truth waited. The first room belonged to the children, evident by the bright wallpaper and scattered toys. But the air here was colder and stiller, and it felt as though time itself had recoiled. The beds were unmade, blankets tossed aside in panic, and against the far wall sat evidence of a final stand. Officers stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing, unable to accept that such cruelty had been possible in this quiet neighborhood. One officer whispered, "No training prepares you for this," and the silence that followed confirmed they all agreed. In the master bedroom, the nightmare reached its peak. The bed was overturned, the dresser drawers pulled out, contents spilling everywhere. But it was not the disarray that stole the officer's breath. It was the unmistakable evidence of loss, final and irreversible. Here, the cruelty had been absolute and the aftermath unbearable. Officers found themselves unable to speak, unwilling to describe out loud what their eyes forced them to witness. Words would only lessen the weight of it, and so they said nothing. They stood together, their silence both a shield and a burden, each man and woman realizing they would never unsee what lay before them. Outside, the flashing lights of patrol cars painted the street red and blue, but inside the house everything remained suffocated in gray. Even when backup arrived, the new officers hesitated before stepping inside, as though instinct warned them of the weight they were about to carry. One veteran officer, known for his hardened resolve, leaned against the wall, his face pale. Later, he would tell a therapist that for the first time in his career, he felt something inside him fracture. Not break completely, but bend in a way that never returned to normal. By the time the coroner arrived, silence had settled like dust. Reports were taken, evidence logged, Photographs snapped, but nothing could capture the true horror of that home. The story would later be summarized in official language, stripped of its raw pain. Incident occurred, victims found, suspect unknown. But the officers who stood inside that house knew the truth was far beyond words. It was not just a crime, it was the shattering of human innocence. The kind that leaves even the strongest needing therapy to cope. When the crime scene unit finally entered, the officers who had first discovered the house stepped aside, but not because they were ready to leave. Their bodies were still rooted in shock, their minds replaying every detail in a loop. One of them kept rubbing his temples. Another's hand trembled as he lit a cigarette outside despite never smoking on duty. It was not just about the horror of what they saw. It was about the helplessness. The knowledge that by the time they arrived, it was already too late. For police, time is often the difference between life and death. But here time had been the enemy. No amount of training manuals or tactical drills prepared them for walking into a place where hope had been extinguished so completely. They were trained to handle criminals, even bloodshed. But they were not trained to look into the eyes of lost innocence frozen in silence. The house quickly filled with forensic teams, snapping photographs and collecting fragments of evidence. Each flash of the camera revealed another detail, another layer of devastation. The officers could barely bring themselves to watch, yet they could not look away. On the kitchen counter sat a half-written note, words smudged, lines unfinished, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. The words spoke of fear, of someone sensing danger too late, of love written in haste and desperation. Reading those words aloud was almost unbearable, for it turned faceless victims into real people who lived, loved, and tried to survive. One officer held the note in gloved hands and muttered under his breath, "This isn't just evidence, this is a cry." That line stuck with everyone in the room. Outside, neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape, whispering, gasping, and some even crying as rumors spread. To them, this was unthinkable. The family inside had been friendly and ordinary, the type who waved at passers-by and attended community events. No one could understand how darkness had slipped into such a quiet corner of the world. Reporters began to show up, cameras pointed at the flashing lights, but the officers avoided them, unwilling to share what they had seen. How could anyone explain it? How could words capture the soundless despair of those rooms? The media would twist it into headlines, but for those who entered, the images would never fade into ink or broadcast. They were seared into memory. Later that night, the detectives interviewed neighbors, piecing together the timeline. They learned of strange noises, of arguments overheard, and of a shadowy figure seen lurking in the days before. Each testimony painted a picture of warning signs ignored and signals missed. Officers listening to these accounts felt a heavy burden. If someone had acted earlier, perhaps this could have been prevented. That guilt sank deep, leaving scars invisible but lasting. One of the detectives admitted afterward that this case made him question everything, not just his job, but humanity itself. Back at the station, the officers who had entered first sat in silence. The paperwork lay before them, but they could not write. Every time they tried to put pen to paper, the images came flooding back. The child's handprints, the stuffed toy, the desperate note. These were not just details, they were wounds carved into their minds. Some officers tried to laugh it off, using dark humor as a shield, but the laughter fell flat. Others stared blankly, lost in thought. A young recruit whispered that he wanted to quit, that if this was what the job meant, he was not strong enough. His superior put a hand on his shoulder, but said nothing, because what words could make this better? The following days brought little relief. Each officer was forced to sit through counseling sessions, mandated by the department. But therapy is not a quick fix. They spoke about nightmares, about waking up drenched in sweat, and about hearing voices in their sleep. One officer confessed that he avoided his own children, unable to look them in the eye without seeing the faces from the crime scene. Another admitted he could no longer enter his kitchen without flinching at the sight of fingerprints on the refrigerator. Trauma has a way of attaching itself to the smallest things, turning everyday life into constant reminders. The investigation itself revealed cruel details, each one more unbearable than the last. Detectives pieced together how the suspect had methodically trapped the victims, cutting off their chances of escape. They uncovered evidence of planning, of a twisted mind that found satisfaction in suffering. This was not a crime of passion, not a sudden act of rage. It was deliberate, calculated, and cold. That realization cut even deeper, because it meant the horror was not an accident of circumstance. It was intentional. Evil had worn a human face, and it had walked freely among them. Weeks passed, but the officers could not escape the shadow of that night. The suspect remained at large, and the weight of failure pressed down harder with each passing day. Every time the phone rang, every time a new call came in, they braced themselves for another nightmare, another house of horrors. For some, the badge felt heavier than ever before. What once symbolized duty and honor now felt like a reminder of what they could not undo. One officer summed it up best during a late-night shift, his voice hollow as he stared into his untouched coffee. "We carry guns for protection, but no one ever gave us armor for the soul." The manhunt stretched into weeks, and with every day that passed, frustration turned into obsession. Detectives followed leads across the city, combing through security footage, tracking financial records, and speaking to anyone who might have known the suspect. But each lead ended in a dead end, and each failure felt like a betrayal to the victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Officers carried the weight of their silence, remembering the lifeless house and the innocence stripped away within its walls. They did not just want justice, they needed it, as if finding the suspect might somehow allow them to heal. But healing, they soon discovered, is not that simple. The crime scene lingered in their minds like a recurring nightmare. Even in broad daylight, the memory returned in flashes. One officer described it as walking into a movie that never stops playing, except there was no exit, no credits, and no end. He could be sitting at home, surrounded by his family, and suddenly the smell of bleach would transport him back to that bathroom, and the sound of laughter on television would morph into silence from that child's room. For the first time in his career, he dreaded going home. Not because of danger outside, but because quiet moments left too much room for memory. Meanwhile, the neighborhood struggled under its own shadow. The house stood empty, its windows boarded, its walls silent. People walked past quickly, avoiding the sight, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Parents warned children not to ask questions, though the kids already knew. Everyone knew. The once peaceful street had become a landmark of tragedy, a reminder that evil could live next door without anyone suspecting. Reporters returned often, their cameras capturing the decaying flowers and fading candles left at the makeshift memorial. But the officers avoided those broadcasts. They did not need a camera to remind them. They had lived it. In the department, therapy became a routine. Some officers resisted, insisting they were fine, that the job hardened them against such things. But even the toughest began to crack. One officer broke down during a session, admitting that when he closed his eyes, he heard the faint cry of a child that never existed, his mind replaying what he had imagined in that silent room. Another officer confessed he could not enter a toy store for his niece's birthday because every aisle reminded him of that stuffed toy left untouched on the floor. These confessions were not weakness, they were scars, proof of the human cost of what they had endured. The suspect, when finally identified, added another layer of horror. He was ordinary. Not a monster by appearance, not someone who would stand out in a crowd. He worked a job, paid bills, and smiled at clerks in stores. The realization that someone so average could commit something so evil unsettled even the most experienced detectives. It was not just the act that chilled them, but the disguise of normalcy. They had always been told to look for danger in shadows, but here danger had worn the mask of familiarity. The betrayal of that truth shook them to their core. When the arrest came, it was not cinematic, no car chases, no gunfire. He was found in a cheap motel, sitting on the bed, unbothered, almost bored. The officers who took him into custody described a moment of rage bubbling inside them, the urge to strike, to scream, to demand why. But the suspect said nothing, his face blank, his eyes hollow. Some officers admitted they hated him more for his calmness than for his actions. His indifference was more terrifying than if he had shown malice. It was as though he had simply erased the humanity of his victims and moved on without thought. At trial, the details resurfaced, reopening wounds that had barely begun to close. Photographs were shown, evidence displayed, and testimonies given. The officers were forced to relive every step of that night, this time under the cold lights of a courtroom. Defense lawyers tried to humanize the suspect, to paint a picture of a troubled life, of reasons that could explain the unexplainable. But the officers knew better. There was no justification. Evil does not need a reason, it only needs an opportunity. The jury reached its verdict, but the verdict did not end the pain. Justice was served on paper, yet the scars remain. One officer explained it best: "We got the conviction, but no conviction gives back the lives. No sentence clears the pictures in my head." Therapy continued, but so did nightmares. They learned to live with the memory, but living with it is not the same as forgetting. The badge on their chest had always carried weight, but after this case, it carried a ghost too. Years later, some of the officers had retired and others had transferred, but whenever they gathered and spoke in private, the story of that house returned. It was the unspoken bond they carried, a wound only they understood. Some drank too much, some withdrew from family, some found religion, but none walked away untouched. That is the truth rarely told about law enforcement. Justice comes with a cost, and sometimes that cost is their peace of mind. The years that followed were supposed to bring closure, but instead they deepened the wounds. The officers who walked into that house on the first night found themselves forever marked. Some stayed on the force, but their work changed. They were no longer the same people who once laughed during night shifts or swapped stories over coffee. Their conversations grew quieter, their patience shorter. The house had become their shadow, and no matter how far they moved, it followed. One officer admitted he avoided birthdays at his own home, unable to watch his children blow out candles without feeling guilt. Another described how even the smell of fresh paint made him nauseous, because it reminded him of the stifling chemical air in the crime scene. These were not wounds that showed on the body, but they were carved deep into the soul. Counselors called it secondary trauma, but the officers felt it more directly, like a poison in their blood. The badge had always come with danger, but this was different. They were not fighting bullets or knives. They were fighting memories, and memories cannot be handcuffed. Some tried to drown the images with alcohol. Others buried themselves in work, volunteering for every call, as if exhaustion might erase what had been seen. But late at night, when the city grew quiet, their minds replayed the same images: the child's handprints, the unfinished note, the blank face of the man they arrested. These memories refused to fade, haunting them in ways more violent than any suspect could. The community moved forward, though the stain of the crime never truly left. The house was eventually torn down, replaced with a new build, shiny and modern, but the people who lived nearby still whispered when they walked past. Parents clutched their children tighter, and for years, trick or treaters skipped that street entirely, as though the ghost still lingered. Officers avoided the neighborhood too, not because they were afraid of crime, but because they were afraid of memory. Even a passing glance at that corner brought back the crushing silence of that night. Some of the officers retired earlier than planned. They said it was for family or health, but their colleagues knew better. One officer had nightmares so vivid he would wake screaming, convinced he was back in the house. His wife finally begged him to leave the job before it killed him from the inside. Another officer, one of the youngest from that night, simply walked away. He packed his locker one afternoon and never came back, leaving only a note: "I cannot carry this anymore." For the rest of the department, that resignation became a grim reminder that no one leaves such horror untouched. The suspect, locked behind bars, rarely spoke. He did not apologize, did not explain. He existed in silence, and that silence was louder than any confession. During one of the appeal hearings, an officer was called to testify again, forced to look at the man across the courtroom. He later said that the suspect's empty eyes were worse than the crime scene itself. It was the absence of remorse that made him sick, the chilling realization that the man who had caused such devastation had nothing inside him to regret. "Evil without guilt," he said, "is the kind of thing that destroys your faith in humanity." Some officers turned to faith as a way of surviving. They prayed, not for justice that had already been served, but for peace, for some way to quiet their minds. Others found solace in therapy, though progress was slow. One officer confessed during a session that he had developed a habit of checking his children's rooms 3 times each night, terrified that one day silence might greet him the way it did in that house. Another admitted he could not stand the sound of a child crying in public without breaking down. These were not just coping mechanisms, they were the hidden consequences of carrying the unseen scars of their job. The department quietly recognized the cost. Training manuals were rewritten. Mandatory counseling was introduced earlier, and officers were taught not just how to handle weapons, but how to handle grief. It was a step forward, but for those who had lived through that night, it felt like too little, too late. They had already paid the price. The tragedy had become a case study for recruits, but the reality was never captured in the files. A report can record fingerprints and blood patterns, but it cannot record the way silence makes your stomach twist or the way a toy left behind can haunt you forever. Years later, some of the officers gathered for a reunion of sorts, not an official event, but a quiet meeting in a bar away from the city. They spoke in fragments, in half sentences, each man and woman finishing the other's thoughts without saying too much. They did not need to describe what they saw, they all already knew. They drank, they remembered, and for a few hours, they shared the burden together. One of them raised a glass and said, "We survived it, but we didn't leave it behind." Everyone nodded, no one argued. The crime had ended years ago, but for the officers it had never truly ended. They carried it every day, in the way they walked, in the way they spoke, and in the way they shielded themselves from joy because joy felt fragile. They learned the hard truth that justice does not heal, that therapy only eases, and that sometimes survival means learning to live with ghosts. And when they closed their eyes at night, the house came back. Always the house, always the silence, always the unbearable memory of a crime so heartbreaking it left even the strongest in need of therapy. The final chapter of this story is not found in the arrest records or the trial transcripts. It exists in the quiet, private moments where the officers live with what they saw. Long after the headlines faded, after the community tried to patch its wounds, and after the suspect was locked away, the memories stayed alive. They lingered in dreams, in sudden flashes during ordinary days, and in the smallest details and reopened old wounds. One officer, long since retired, admitted he could not sit in a kitchen without feeling uneasy. Something as simple as the sound of a refrigerator humming became unbearable. For another, the smell of children's crayons triggered tears. These were not things that outsiders could understand, but for those who entered that house, the world would never be ordinary again. Families of the officers carried the weight too. Wives, husbands, and children watched as their loved ones grew distant, quieter, and more guarded. The officers rarely spoke of the case at home, but the silence said enough. Some became more protective, unable to let their children out of sight. Others withdrew, unable to connect, as if speaking too much might let the memories slip out. Marriages strained, friendships drifted. Trauma has a way of spilling beyond the person who carries it. It seeps into every relationship, every home. Those who loved the officers learned to recognize the signs: a sudden stare into the distance, a restless night, a refusal to talk. They understood something had broken that could never be fully repaired. The department did its best to honor them. They were praised for their bravery, awarded commendations, and called heroes. But none of those medals, none of those speeches erased the truth. Being called a hero did not quiet the nightmares and did not erase the images burned into their minds. In fact, some officers admitted it made them feel worse. They did not feel heroic. They felt powerless. They had arrived too late to save anyone, and that sense of failure cut deeper than any words of praise could heal. To be celebrated publicly while suffering privately was a contradiction that left them hollow. Over time, some of them found ways to cope. One officer took up painting, pouring his nightmares onto canvas in dark colors and broken shapes. Another became a mentor, guiding new recruits not just in tactics but in emotional survival. A few left the city entirely, searching for peace in small towns where no one knew their story. But no matter what paths they took, and each carried the same memory the night they walked into a house and came face to face with humanity at its most fragile. The suspect eventually faded into the background of prison life, his name mentioned less and less. But for the officers, his shadow never left. They did not fear him. He was caged, powerless now. But they hated the emptiness he carried, the way he had destroyed lives without hesitation and then lived as if nothing had happened. One officer once said during therapy, "He took away their lives in one night, but he took away ours slowly, every day since." That line captured the essence of the trauma. The crime had two sets of victims: those who died and those who were forced to witness what remained. Society often forgets that truth. People look to officers as protectors, as enforcers of justice, but rarely as human beings who bleed inside. The uniform may be strong, but the heart beneath it is still vulnerable. This case proved it. It was not just about crime, It was about the price of carrying crime on your shoulders. Officers needed therapy, not because they were weak, but because they were human. To see such things and remain untouched would not be strength, it would be inhumanity. And so the legacy of that night is one of silence and survival. Silence, because words cannot capture the horror, and survival, because moving forward is the only choice. The officers do not forget, they do not heal completely, but they continue. Some protect their families with fiercer love. Some guide the next generation of officers with quiet wisdom. Some live alone, carrying their ghosts privately. But all of them are bound by the same truth. What they saw was the most heartbreaking crime they will ever hear, ever witness, or ever carry. Years may pass, but sometimes late at night, when the city is still, when memories come uninvited, they find themselves back in that house. They see the overturned chair, the scattered toys, and the handprints on the refrigerator. They feel the same silence pressing against their chest, the same helplessness, the same sorrow. Therapy helps them manage, but it does not erase. And maybe it never should, because forgetting would mean losing the memory of the lives taken, and that in itself would be another injustice. This is the story of officers who wore the badge, walked into a nightmare and left with scars no one could see. It is the story of how crime destroys not only its direct victims, but also those who bear witness. And it is the story of how survival sometimes means not overcoming the memory, but learning to live alongside it. That is why cops needed therapy after what they saw. Not because they were unprepared, not because they were weak, but because what happened that night was never meant for human eyes. The story you have just heard is not one that fades away when the video ends. It is the kind of story that lingers, the kind that crawls into your thoughts when the night grows too quiet. What those officers walked into that night was more than a crime scene. It was the destruction of innocence, the collapse of safety, and the kind of loss that reshapes lives forever. The victims lost everything, but the officers who bore witness lost something too: their peace of mind, their belief that training and duty could shield them from true horror.